When people talk about a perfect circle, they usually talk about the voice or the lyrics, the unique frontman standing in the spotlight. But behind that sound is a guitarist most rock fans wouldn't even pick out of a lineup. Before A Perfect Circle, Billy Howerdel spent years working behind the scenes as a guitar technician for a band like Tool or 9 Inch Nails or The Smashing Pumpkins. During that time, he was writing songs of his own and slowly developing the atmospheric style that later would become his trademark. Eventually, he played some of those songs to a friend he had met while working with Tool. That friend was Maynard James Keenan. Maynard immediately saw something in the material and offered him to sing on it. Those demos would eventually become the foundation of A Perfect Circle. But, fun fact, Maynard wasn't actually Billy's first choice for the band. In fact, he had someone completely different in mind for the role of the singer. But we'll come back to that later on in the video. Today, we're doing more than just looking at Billy Howerdel's career and gear. We're going to find out what makes his sound so unique, what guitar players can learn from his gear decisions, and what, most importantly, how you can apply the same ideas yourself without needing a rockstar budget or filing for a personal bankruptcy. So let's get to know one of the most overlooked guitarists of the last 25 years. If you expect Billy Howerdels' rig to be some kind of a secret wizardry, you're probably going to be disappointed. At its core, his setup is surprisingly simple. A handful of Les Pauls, Tom Anderson pickups, a modified Marshall, a fractal, that's basically it. In fact, during a rig rundown, he openly admitted that he could probably do an entire tour with only 2 guitars. That tells me a lot about how he thinks. Once he finds something that works, he sticks with it and spends years refining it. And that's where we find our first principle that we can apply to ourselves: stick with what you have and keep it simple. Now, while working with Trent Reznor's guitar tech during the Downward Spiral era, he ended up with heavily damaged Les Pauls that had literally survived years of 9 Inch Nails destruction. The headstock had been ripped off, parts came from different guitars. By a collector's standard, it should have been nearly worthless. For Billy, it became his #1 guitar. And that guitar eventually evolved into the blueprint for nearly everything he plays nowadays. And that's where we get our second principle. Cheap doesn't mean bad. Most of his Les Pauls use Tom Anderson H3 and H1 humbuckers and are tuned down to C# using unusual heavy strings. He even developed his own custom string gauges because standard sets didn't feel right in those tunings. Which leads me to our third principle. Great tone doesn't start using knobs. It starts by experiment with what you already have. Now, amp setup. The core sound comes from a by Dave Friedman modified 1978 Marshall J&P Super Lead. This modified version becomes the starting point for the extremely rare Friedman Naked. This shouldn't be confused with the famous Brown-Eyed or BE circuit, which came from a different source, Friedman's own 1968 Plexi running through a Variant. So, if you spend enough time on guitar forums, you've probably seen people chasing Billy Howerdel's gear for years. The problem is that most of them are really chasing the wrong thing. What makes Billy Howerdel special isn't its guitar, and it isn't its amp either, and it certainly isn't the specific XFX preset. What makes Billy Howerdel special is the way he thinks about guitar. Most guitarists use effects to enhance what they're already playing. Billy often writes parts around the effects themselves. Take away the delays and the modulation and the ambience, and many of his guitar parts suddenly feel surprisingly simple. Listen to songs like The Hollow or 3 Libras of Weak and Powerless, and you'll notice the guitar is rarely trying to dominate the mix. Instead, It's working together with the effects to create a kind of mood. The repeats become part of the rhythm. The ambience becomes a part of the harmony. The texture becomes a part of the composition. And that's probably the biggest lesson we can learn from Billy Howerdel. Which brings us to our final principle. Stop thinking about effects as something you add after writing a guitar part and start thinking about them as part of the instrument itself. So the secret behind Billy's sound isn't that he uses more effects like anyone else, even at the edge. It's that he composes with them. And once you understand that, you stop asking how to sound exactly like Billy Howerdel, and you start asking how to use the same ideas to develop your own sound. So what can we take away from the gear from Billy Howerdel? First, stick with what you have and keep it simple. Cheap doesn't mean bad. Great tone doesn't start by tuning knobs, it starts by experimenting with what you have. And stop thinking about effects as something you add after the guitar part. Start thinking about them as part of the instrument itself. Now let's translate those principles into your own setup. If I wanted to build a Billy Howerdel inspired preset on something like the Quad Cortex, I'd start with a Marshall style amp like the JMP Super Lead or a JC Main 100, keeping the gain around the edge of breakup so the delays and reverbs still have plenty of headroom and definition. For the cabinet, I'd go for a Marshall 4x12 loaded with Celestion V30s or an equivalent IR if you have one available. From there, I'd place a subtle chorus after the amp to add width without making it obvious. Then split the signal into two parallel delay paths. One should be a short digital delay and add a rhythmic definition, while the other would be a longer analog style or tape delay to create depth and movement. Finally, I'd bring both paths back together into a large plate or a hall reverb with a fairly long decay, just enough to create space without washing the attack. The most important part is getting the balance right. The dry guitar should always stay present while the modulation, delays and reverbs gradually bleed into the performance until they stop feeling like separate effects and become part of the guitar itself. That's exactly how Billy approaches his sound. If you'd rather build a traditional rig, I'd keep it just as simple. Start with a good but affordable Les Paul style like a Holley Benton SC, a vintage V100 or a used second-hand Epiphone Les Paul. For the amp, I'd actually recommend a Marshall DSL 40 combo over a head. It's easier to live with, already comes with a matching speaker, and you don't have to budget for a separate 4x12 cabinet. Or a low box if you want to play silently or record. If you're even tighter on budget, an old Marshall 12 State or the VS65R, I believe, will get you surprisingly far. Then add a multi-effects unit in the effects loop. If you want the closest thing to Billy's routing on a budget, I'll look for the Velaton GP200 or a used GT100 from Boss, since both let you build more complex effects chains with multiple delays and reverbs. If you just want the sound experience without worrying about parallel routing, something like the more GE150 or G200 is already more than capable. And if that's still more than you can spend. Don't overthink it. Plug in a Zoom MS70 CDR into the effects loop. You won't recreate Billys rig one-to-one, but you'll absolutely capture the characteristics of his sound. Remember, Billy's tone doesn't come from complicated gear. It comes from how he combines simple building blocks into one cohesive soundscape. So what you basically need is a fairly decent amp, a playable guitar, and some kind of a modulation effects where you play around with delays and reverbs. That's basically it. So if you stick with what you have, stop judging gear by its price tag and experiment with your setup instead of constantly tuning knobs, and start treating effects as part of the instrument rather than an afterthought. And you'll get surprisingly close, not just to Billy Howerdel's rig, but to the way he approaches the guitar as a whole. And that's, to me, really the takeaway from this video, and it should also for you. Billy's sound isn't the result of some magical piece of gear. It's the result of a simple setup used with intention and refined over years instead of being replaced every few months. Have fun experimenting, have fun enjoying this ride, and I'll catch you in the next hangout.